Good evening, and welcome to the Savannah Book Festival's virtual series. I'm Jonathan Rabb, a member of the festival board, and we are delighted to kick off the series tonight with Brad Thor, the number one New York Times best-selling writer of 20 thrillers, including Backlash, Spymaster, The Last Patriot, Blowback, and of course, The Lions of Lucerne. His most recent, Near Dark, was an instant number one bestseller. Not only a writer, Brad has served as a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Analytic Red Cell Unit and has appeared on countless news outlets as an expert on terrorism. He has even taken the bold step to shadow a black ops team in Afghanistan in order to make sure that the research for his novel, The Apostle, was his own lived experience. Brad's is a fiction rooted firmly in a terrifying but very real world, and his approach makes the reading of it all the more compelling. Tonight, the Savannah Book Festival would like to thank Schultz Eye and Surgery Center for sponsoring the event. The event itself will last about an hour, and Brad will answer questions submitted during tonight's talk, which will take about 30 to 40 minutes. To submit a question, please click Ask a Question on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and type it in. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Welcome, Brad, and thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Jonathan. I just wish that I could be doing this in person with you this year. I love Savannah, and when I got asked to do this event virtually, I jumped at the chance. So it's wonderful to be back with all of you again.
Well, you're very kind. Of course, we'd love to have you here too, and you are welcome anytime you want to come. I'm going to jump in with a question I think that will inspire a lot of our viewers tonight and perhaps betray a little jealousy on my part. You have an uncanny ability to research, write, edit, and promote a new novel every single year, which to some of us seems somewhat superhuman. I would love if you could just take us through that process. What is the cycle like that allows you to do it so successfully?
Well, thank you for the question. You would think that after doing it 20 times, it'd get easier, and it doesn't. It gets harder and harder each year, it feels like, to come up with something I haven't done before. That's number one. And then something that I don't think anybody else has done with the plot. I think it was, I think it was Louis L'Amour who said that you cannot even be a halfway decent writer without being a voracious reader. And so I'm constantly reading. I read fiction, I read nonfiction, and I'm also a big news junkie, and I'm particularly interested in geopolitics. So I'm always trying to find what my next story might be. I've got a friend who's a terrific writer named James Rollins, and whenever Jim is on book tour, he gets asked, where do your ideas come from? And he says, well, I clip newspaper articles all throughout the year and drop them in a box. And then when it comes time to write my next book, I shake the box and say, oh, magic box, give me my next great idea. And whatever he pulls out, that's going to be his book. But for me, it's a little bit more organic than that. Something will catch my attention in the news, and I'll look at it, Jonathan, and say, well, this is what the news says it is, but what does that story look like from the back door, if you will? If you turned it around, what would that look like? And I want to find something that excites me. A friend and author, David Morrell, who's just, before I ever became an author, I loved, and I still love reading David's books. David said that the idea that you have for your novel really has to excite you because you're going to spend the next year working on it. So I look for things that I haven't heard about or that are about to happen in the next year or two on the world stage, and then try to come up with a plot that'll remain evergreen. Because, yeah, I've got 20 books, and I tell people they're like the James Bond movies. You don't need to have ever seen the James Bond movie to go out and see the latest one. And that's what I try to do with my books, too, because I have a recurring protagonist. I don't want people to feel like, oh, Near Dark is the latest one, but I have to go back to the beginning, The Lions of Lucerne. So there's a little bit of a delicate balance there. And then the actual process during the year for writing is I'm a husband, I'm a dad. and I want to be able to be home with the family. So I treat it like a job. I get up in the morning and used to get the kids out the door to school. My kids are doing remote learning now, but I like to see them for breakfast, and then I work out and then get into my office, and I'm in by 8 and I'm out at 6:30 so that I'm home in time for dinner. And it really is seat of pants to seat of chair. You have to be, this as a fellow scribe, Jonathan, that writers are the ultimate procrastinators, right? So I've got a clean office, clean closets. My car looks fantastic. And it's all because I'm supposed to be writing right now. So it's kind of my wife's favorite time of year, because everything she's asked me to do actually gets done now. So it really is all about self-discipline to be able to get out a book a year.
Yeah, I love the idea that, you're going for the idea first, that you get something that jazzes you. But at the same time, you do have this character who we've come to know. And I'm sure some of us think, well, we know him better than you do. We've spent so much time with him. How do you then shape that idea to this character and the world that you've created for him so that it makes sense that that idea will work for him?
Right. So there's even an additional element that goes in there. And thank you for noticing those parts that are so critical. I also have to reveal a little bit more about the character. So I'm constantly learning about him, because I want people to see deeper and deeper inside him and what drives him and all that kind of stuff. So I've had him evolve career-wise over the books. But that really does become the linchpin, right? Is I've got this idea that I'm excited about, but I have to connect it to the protagonist. I have to make it worth his while. And it's funny because in the book that I'm writing now for next summer, I had to figure out, how do I do this? How do I connect this story with him? Is it just dumb luck? Are there some kind of evil forces behind the scenes that are pushing the plot in his direction? Does he stumble across it? And I spent a lot of time over the summer trying to figure out, how do I plug him into this plot in a way that readers will find believable? And it's got to happen quick, because I really believe that you need to get that action on page 1. You've got to light the fuse and let that rocket take off immediately. Start with action and explain it later is an old maxim that I love. So, but there's so much that has to happen up here before I sit down and type. It can get a little frustrating at times. The only thing that's harder, I think, is coming up with titles.
No one has ever gone with the title that I've come up with myself. It always gets strange. But I will say that with this book, with Near Dark, after Backlash and after, the frenzy to get Scott back into a place where his feet were sort of solidly on the ground, because you really pulled the rug out from under him. I mean, everything in his world was done. And I think there was a feeling, at least for me reading this one, that we were finding a new part of Scott this time. I mean, he's much more emotionally attuned. He's much more self-aware. Even in the way that he interacts, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Sauve, is that, there's a delicacy there, and he recognizes the stakes in a way I'm not sure, one would have expected, which was fantastic. Did you know, when you were writing the last, let's say 2, 3 books, that shift was going to come in his character? Or did that just sort of evolve in the moment when you were writing it?
So this is a great question. So we're going to peel back the curtain, the two of us, and let people see how the sausage is made a little bit in our world, Jonathan. So 2 books before Near Dark, my book Spymaster, wrote it, turned it into my editor, and she loved it. She got to the very last page, got to the last sentence, and said, I want a little bit more here. I want you to add to this. I don't want people to have it end here and close the book and that's it. And I said, well, what do you want? She said, well, you're the writer. Figure out something. Put it in. I love it. I come up with title ideas, and she says no. But she's given me my 2 last titles. She's been fantastic. So I went back to her and said, well, what about this? How about if, instead of ending it at the end of this paragraph, I add a couple more and the following happens in those paragraphs? And she loved that. So I extended the book by about 2 paragraphs. She thought it was fantastic. And what it did was it inserted a cliffhanger I didn't even know what was going to happen. So Spymaster ends with a cliffhanger, and I didn't even know how that cliffhanger was going to play out. And what's interesting is that I started working on it, got to Backlash, and then finished up Backlash, and something interesting happened. Came to me and said a big national bookseller would like it if you could add a whole additional chapter to the end of Backlash so that they could have a special edition that'll only be sold in their stores. And I said, oh, what am I going to do? The book's done. How do all the threads are tied up and all this kind of stuff. So I came up with this idea that $100 million bounty would be placed on Harvath's head at the end of this special edition. And editor loved it. Everybody thought it was great. We gave it to the retailer and everything. But I realized it created a problem for me because my children love the Avengers movies. And so we always have to sit through the credits because we know there's going to be another scene.
Right.
And those other scenes are part of the Marvel universe. So when I created a bonus chapter for this retailer, that's part of my universe, of my protagonist, Scott Harvath. So I had to start Backlash with that bonus chapter that explains the putting of the bounty on his head, which is what Near Dark is all about. But it backed me into a corner because when I had done that bonus chapter a year ago, I never thought I'd be basing a book off of it. I never thought it would be the bedrock for a brand new book, but it had to be. It was in the Scott Harvath universe now, and I had to deal with that. So I was in this tough position of, okay, well, what makes sense? What am I going to do? And I liked that Harvath was at his lowest, personally, professionally. He had gone through so much, didn't know if he wanted to go back, was drinking heavily and all this kind of stuff. And I started really, during Backlash, having him look inward and be a little bit more emotional, if you will, or the readers were getting to see a side of him that they hadn't gotten to see before. But I write in a vacuum. I don't know if it's working at all until somebody reads the completed manuscript. And that was a constant fear I had writing Backlash is Harvath being too emotional based on what he's gone through. And then with this year's book, Near Dark, I also had that because I really don't know until the book gets into the hands of my agent and my editor. And they give me good advice, but it's the people who don't have skin in my game that I really want to hear from. And those are my bosses, the readers. And they've loved this look inside Harvath, this deep dive, this better rounding, if you will, of his character.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's fascinating that it came from someplace, almost serendipity. And I have to say, the character now, there's a richness to him. I hope people have read this book, Near Dark. If you haven't, it's fantastic. Go get it. But the introduction of that character of Sylvie, I mean, those of us who finished are thinking, okay, there's still hope for this guy. And I don't think we would cotton to that as quickly if there wasn't this deeper sense of who he is. And I think it's wonderful that you've done that. Although I will say, and this leads to my next question, the underlying thing about the character and all your characters is, the best way I can put it is, there's just a swagger to them. There's this great sense that they walk onto the page and they're moving. There's a little twinkle in the eye, but they go, I mean, I keep on talking about her, and maybe it's because of the way you describe her, but you've got this tall Norwegian drink of water who carries such an unbelievable punch. She's dynamite.
Thank you. The challenge, what I wanted to do was I wanted to create let me back up. My readership, Jonathan, is about 60% male, 40% female. And the female readership is growing the fastest. And female characters have never been window dressing in my books. They've always been critical to my protagonist figuring out what was going on and achieving his objective. In the female characters in my novels are all an homage to the brilliant women I have around me, whether it's my wife, my daughter, my agent, my editor, my VP who works at my company. These women inspire me, and I want to write characters, particularly that my daughter can read and say, yeah, I really like that. I like that about her. There's nothing holding her back. The fact that she's a woman doesn't stop her. She's just as gifted as the guys in the book. And so with Sylvie in Near Dark, I wanted to create somebody who was just as skilled, just as smart alecky, just as intelligent, if not more so, than Scott Harvath. And I wanted to do that particularly for my female readers. I was hoping that Solvi would really, really resonate with them. And what's funny is she did. So mission accomplished. Female readers loved Solvi. But what was amazing was how many guys flipped their lids over
Wow, come
this
on.
character and said, "You've got to give her own book. We don't even want to read about Scott Harvath. Give her own book," which is kind of neat. So
would you ever think of doing that? Would you ever step away and say, "Let me give you the backstory"? Because we have some of the backstory, and it's devastating with her. She's come the cleverness in giving him a character as his counterpart now, whose world was completely stripped away too. I mean, the parallels are perfect. I can completely understand. Would you ever think of just having what would they used to be called? Those little Amazon, short,
yeah,
about 5,000. Would you ever do one of those?
I might. I've likened Solvi's past has got just as much pain, just as much darkness as Harvath's does. And here I am. Maybe you, as a fellow writer, can help me come up with a better picture than this. But I kind of describe the two of them like if you had dropped two coffee cups on the floor in your kitchen and they both shattered, and you could only put the pieces together to make one cup, one big kind of cafe au lait mug, and it's jagged and it's got sharp edges. If you don't hold it the right way, you're going to slash your finger. And that's the way I see the two of them together, that they've got all these cracks and rough edges and everything. And I think they actually are better characters when they're in the story together than they might be on their own. So I'm so excited about the book I'm working on now. But would I do something for Solvi? I might. People have asked me, oh, can we see Harvath's first operation? The first time Harvath ever went kinetic, ever killed a guy. What was that like for him, and that kind of a thing. So these opportunities are out there to do those. If only I had a reason to stay home, locked down, and not go anywhere or do anything, and had the time. Be careful what you wish for, right?
No, but that makes perfect sense. It really does. That you've created, the synergy between them is what makes that book cook. And I mentioned the word swagger, and I knew I was going to ask you this question. It's not just the characters who have a swagger. Your writing has a swagger. I mean, there's an aggression to your prose. You move, you move, you move. Is that something that when you sat down, the first time you thought, I'm going to write a book, is that the way it came out, or is that something that you've cultivated? Because, you can always tell when you're reading a Brad Thor book. I mean, it just pounds at you. Is that just natural?
Well, so I grew up. My dad had been, he's a no longer active U.S. Marine. The Marine Corps got him out of the south side of Chicago, GI Bill to go to college. My mom had been a flight attendant for TWA in the glamour days in the 1960s. And they both became entrepreneurs. And my parents have always been very serious about you go to work and you treat each day as if it's your first day, and that if you're not careful, it could also be your last day. And you constantly want to be improving. So the late Vince Flynn, who I was friendly with, I'd asked Vince once, would you ever go back to your first book, Term Limits, and maybe tighten it up? And he said, Brad, I drive myself crazy if I went backwards. There'd always be things I could find that I could change. So for me, and back to my folks, in this kind of Midwestern work ethic and not taking your readers for granted, I spend a tremendous amount of time during the year trying to get better as a writer. And what's really funny is a couple of years ago, I stumbled across an app, and it was all part of procrastination, not digging in and really, welding myself to my office chair, working on the book. I'd gotten a couple chapters done, and I found this app, which is really, really cool. It's called the Hemingway app. And if you take chunks of your writing and drop it into the Hemingway app, it will tell you right away what grade level you're writing at, if you have too many adverbs, if your sentences go on too long and should be chopped up, and that kind of a thing. So I read books about creative writing all year long, every single year, because I really believe that you can get better as a writer. So the style I have now, I don't think is the style that I started with. A certain amount of your voice, I think, is going to be natural and is going to be there. But I really do believe that writing is a craft, and you can get better at it. You can hone those skills just the way, you'll find athletes spend an extra, 20 minutes in the gym more than the rest of the team. And they're able to shave just, a fraction of a second off their, how fast they can run 50, 100 yards. So I'm constantly tweaking and trying to get better, not so that it's not recognizable. I want people to say, okay, yeah, I knew this was a Brad Thor book. Even if I didn't have the jacket on it, I would know this is a Brad Thor book. But I do believe that it's incumbent upon me to get better. I'm never going to phone it in. And so that's the pressure I put on myself, is I'm so grateful for my readers that I constantly want to keep elevating my game, whether it's plots, characters, whatever it may be, but particularly with the writing too. Because when you think about it, Jonathan, books are expensive. I mean, it's great value for the money. The amount of time, I mean, if you spend $30 for a hardcover and it can entertain you for nights and nights or an entire weekend or a full afternoon, I think it's a great value for the money. But the one thing that's finite is your time. So if you as a reader are going to entrust me with a finite resource, your time, you can go out and make more money, but you can't make more time. That's something you could have spent on your family, on your career, on some other passion other than reading. So it's really incumbent upon me to give those people, the readers, my bosses, the absolute best I'm capable of. And it's also incumbent upon me to try to get better in the off season, in between books. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah, I love that you call it the off season. Yours is a very short off season compared to many, many other people. But I mean, what you said makes absolutely perfect sense because, what we were talking about before in the emotional quality of Scott, you haven't lost the swagger, but now there's a different way you're shaping it. And I think that's clear to anybody who's read the books. I've always enjoyed, and I think it speaks to this. You always have these moments of great sort of humanity, these tiny little human moments in your books. And what do I mean by that? I'll give an example from Near Dark. That moment when he goes to the Lithuanian truck driver's town, and we know that there is a real chance that Harvath is going to have to do something unsavory with this guy to have him tell him what he needs. And what do? You give us about a quarter of a page of him parking and wondering if he's going to get a ticket or get towed. Now, yeah, that's part of the plot. But I'm thinking, yeah, if I'm in Lithuania and in a truck driver's town, that's the first thing that's going to pop into my head. Oh man, am I going to get a ticket? It's not something that I would think that he would think. And yet you've always had these little moments of just regular old human thought that goes through his head, which sort of act as these breaths. And I'm very impressed with that. And I want to know, do you think that that's the scene where I got to take the breath? Or does
Well,
that happen naturally?
so that is part of, as you know, you have to kind of peaks and valleys, right? So you have to take, it's like a roller coaster. You want people to get excited when it's going clank, 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 and you're going up because they know you're going to drop them and have their hearts get caught in their throats. But everything, people ask me, when you're done with a book, Brad, how much have you pulled out? And the answer is nothing. There is nothing on the floor. Very, very little. If there's anything on the floor, it's because my wife catches the fact that I repeated something from earlier in the book and I don't need it in, 16 chapters later. I forgot that I'd put it in because maybe I wrote those early chapters a month ago. So the whole parking thing, everything serves a purpose, I guess I should say. So yeah, you do get to catch your breath there, but so my brain operates a lot like Harvath does. And I have so many people that I've talked to that do the things that my protagonist does that I realize theirs is really a detail game, Jonathan, because, if you do get a ticket, then all of a sudden that car can be placed at that scene. It's like knowing where the CCTV cameras are and all that kind of stuff. And heaven forbid a cop gets nosy and looks inside. why does this guy have a pair of night vision goggles? If they open the bag that's on the back seat or whatever it is. So all this stuff is because I've had the good fortune of building this incredible network. I don't want to get chewed out by my guys going, dude, you can't just park. See, this is what I hate about movies, Jonathan. Have you ever noticed that when somebody is in a car, there's always a parking space right in front of their destination?
Perfect. Always perfect.
And they always have correct change to pay a bill. So I put in these real life things because these things do happen. They are considerations in the espionage game, the special operations game. And you talk to enough of the folks that go out and do some of this nation's most dangerous business, and they'll tell you, they'll say, it's long periods of boredom punctuated by incredibly tiny seconds of incredible excitement. So I try to keep it real, I guess is the bottom line. I try to keep it real, try to keep him human, not superhuman. But yeah, it's kind of crazy, you would think. He's got to go there and he's got to worry about getting a ticket. Well, there's a lot of ramifications for somebody in the espionage game if they get a ticket. The Israelis blew a huge operation because of people being seen in an elevator camera in a hotel in the Middle East. And in fact, the CIA, a bunch of their officers got in trouble when they went to grab a terrorism suspect in Italy, and they all used their personal cell phones. And the hotels they stayed at, they used their loyalty accounts. They used their real loyalty account numbers. So the Italians were able to reverse engineer who was there. So these things that are very human moments and do seem mundane, they do function on a certain level as part of tradecraft. And there are things that spies have to pay attention to.
No. Of course. I mean, it was clear that, you were giving us the real world, but the way you choose to do it at that moment, I'm always.
Yeah. Well, why then? Yeah. That's
You know,
part of I use I shouldn't joke around about Davey Berkowitz, but there used to be jokes on Saturday Night Live about his mom. And so I always say, because the Son of Sam killer, his dog told him to do it. So I joke around and tell people, why did I do that at that point in the book? Because my dog told me to do it. I mean, it's the muse, I wish I could say that it's incredibly precise and incredibly thoughtful, but for me, it's more of a gut thing. So Dan Brown is a buddy of mine who wrote the Da Vinci Code, and Dan and I have the same agent. And my agent said, "Oh, Brad, you're so organic and you wrestle to get, the plot you want and all this stuff. Have you ever thought about outlining?" Dan outlines, and maybe Dan will share an outline with you. And so Dan shared with me the outline for Da Vinci Code. And it was really cool because I got to see all the stuff that Dan chose to remove from Da Vinci Code, all these scenes. And I'm a big believer in that Robert Frost quote, which is no joy in the writer, no joy in the reader, no surprise in the writer,
right.
No surprise in the reader. So every day I come into my office, I don't know what's going to happen. And that does raise my stress level and makes my job difficult to a certain degree. But it also keeps the job exciting and challenging for me because I want to have the same experience writing the book that you do reading it. So if you found a place where you're like, wow, that fits really well there. I kind of catching my breath. I'm very likely catching my breath as I'm writing it too. So that's my experience as a writer tends to be, I believe this is what it's going to be like for you reading, if that makes any sense.
No, it does, of course. And, the old adage, show, don't tell, is always really just let the reader experience the moment with the writer. Well, if the writer is experiencing the moment with the character, then it's going to work out perfectly. I know that there are a number of people who are going to want to hear about this side of your writing because you are unique in this, where you have connections to certain people that the rest of us don't and might not want to have connections to. How, you've cultivated those over the years, but when you're in the midst of writing a book, when do you know I got to get in touch with my guys? And what's the line that not to cross in terms of how much you can put in a book? I mean, it's clear you're right on the edge.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have a very low bar for when I reach out, and it involves putting my ego aside and saying, I don't know the answer to this question. I can guess, I think I know, but if I'm not 100% certain, then I'm going to reach out. I had a question. It was very interesting. In Near Dark, there is a very unique way that Solvay enters an apartment. And I talked to somebody who has a lot of experience with a apartments in that part of the world and how they're constructed. I talked to another person about how would you enter somebody who is works for the government that would probably go through the front door gun blazing. And so he told me about training they had done and everything. And he said, what kind of weapon does she have? And I said, okay, it's this, and it's got a suppressor. And he said, okay, well, here's what's going to happen if you put that weapon up against a door lock, and here's the kind of door locks that they have in Eastern Europe, blah, 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 blah. So I'm very fortunate to have these relationships. So the bar is extremely low with going to them. They're very generous. They dig it. A lot of them, they won't let me put their real names in my books as a thank you, because they don't want or need the notoriety, and B, they probably shouldn't have it. It's just better that it's kept quiet. So bar very low to go to those people in my network, and they've always been very generous with their time and their expertise, and then leaving stuff out. So what's happened more than once is that pre-pandemic, I used to joke, I buy a lot of beers, a lot of pitchers of beer, and a lot of steak dinners. And I like to just quiet myself and listen to them talk. If I can get a group of them out, it's great. You'll hear stories and all this kind of stuff. And what has happened in some of my thrillers, Jonathan, is that I've shared the manuscript before it even goes to my publisher. And they said, okay, Brad, we told you point A and we told you point C. And your B is too close to the real B. That's all we're going to say. And that needs to come out. And I had one person once make me revise it 7 times. A piece of information in one of the books several books ago. And I said, okay, so now I'm not giving anything away. And my source said to me, no, at this point, they won't be able to track it back to me. He said, it can stay, but now there's no way anybody's going to know I'm one of your sources. And I gave you that. So, I'm an American first and foremost, and I don't want to hurt any of our men and women in the intelligence community, in the military, that kind of thing. So if there's stuff that isn't supposed to be out there, I'm not going to put it out there. But if it's, people used to think Clancy had inside sources in the government and all this stuff. Clancy was an excellent researcher. So that's kind of my thing too, is, okay, well, I don't care if a lot of people haven't heard about this, but it's out there and anybody could dig and find it, then I'm going to use it. But if my guys or my ladies specifically say to me, listen, it'd be really good if you pull that out of the book, just because it could get some people in trouble, maybe get somebody hurt, there's no question. I have no problem. I'm creative. I'll figure something else out.
Have you ever been in a position where someone has said to you, we need you to sign a document right now that says you will never talk about something like that? I mean, have you ever gotten, so I love that, you figured out B, but maybe B is something you're not supposed to even know about.
Yeah, no, nothing that's ever, where they've said, hey, you not only that's got to come out, but you've got to sign like a national security non-disclosure document. I did when Near Dark came out. I heard from somebody at the White House and then somebody aligned with the previous administration who said, where did you get your information? Oh, no, they said, when did you go to Camp David? Because Camp David plays a little bit of a role in Near Dark. When did you go to Camp David? I'm like, I didn't go to Camp David. They said, okay, well, then we'd like to know who you were talking to on the inside, because you obviously have a source inside. And I said, I'm not telling you. I'm not revealing anything. And it wasn't that I had an inside source. I just did some really good research, and information's out there. And that's part of being, let me back up. I think the details are the bedrock, Jonathan, of a good thriller. So I think you have to be willing. Number one, you can't cheat, right? So my wife was a doctor, will not watch Grey's Anatomy. She won't watch ER, all that kind of stuff. I'll read thrillers. I'll read in my genre, not while I'm writing, because I don't want to maybe on a level I'm not aware of be influenced by somebody else's book. But I love to read thrillers. But if you make a mistake, it's kind of like a speed bump, right? Because you have this compact with your readers where they are willing to suspend their disbelief. But if you make enough mistakes, they're going to put your book down. Right. So things like, okay, if you put a safety on a Glock, strike one. My wife will finish any book she starts. She will. And she'll say, oh, that book was terrible. If she doesn't like it. She won't stop. She'll commit and read right to the end. I'll give you, 3 strikes and then I'm out. Sort of a thing, especially when it's stuff that you could have found out if you've been willing to do the research.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the trust that you have with the reader. I mean, you establish that early on and you say, look, trust me, and I'll trust you. I'm not going to give
Hmm.
you every piece of information. We can go do this together. And that's what makes narrative, book. I guess the flip side of my question, has anybody in that community ever come to you for advice on how to deal with certain situations? Obviously,
Hmm.
you've spoken about, I mean, your expertise is in this world. What has that been like?
So after 9/11, the federal government, and I'm not somebody that jumps up and down praising the federal government on creating new programs. Uh, so the federal government came up with what I think is probably the most forward-thinking and aggressive program I've ever heard about in my life. And they put something together called the Analytic Red Cell Unit. Before the 9/11 Commission was ever impaneled, they knew that 9/11 had happened because they just weren't creative enough in DC. One of the problems that you have with government anywhere in the world, and in military systems and everything, is you can get into a kind of a groupthink, a lot of thinking what's in front of you. You're actually looking in your rearview mirror at what's already happened. You're actually not looking out towards the horizon. So after 9/11, this analytic red cell unit was put together at the Department of Homeland Security, and they invited creative thinkers into DC to make sure they never got caught with their creative pants down again. So I got brought in. Michael Bay, the director of the Transformers movies, was brought in. A fabulous, fabulous writer who's a dear friend of mine, Brad Meltzer, was
Sure.
brought in, and they asked us to help them brainstorm different scenarios. Sometimes they wanted them just out of whole cloth. Sometimes we were kind of suspect at one point because they would give us a couple of clues and say, "Okay, in Marrakesh, and this happened in Barbados, and this person went missing in Amsterdam." How would you connect these things together? It was really wild, and you suspect that maybe you were getting some like legit intel that they hadn't been able to. It's like they had a few puzzle pieces without the cover of the box. They didn't know what the picture was to put stuff together. So, as the son of a United States Marine, it was a really cool opportunity for me to be asked to serve my country, not by picking up a rifle, but by using the gray matter between my ears.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think we are at the point where I have to. I mean, I've been watching the screen go with questions, questions, questions. So to be fair, I'm now going to get some questions for you from the folks who have
Okay.
been.
I'm going to take a sip of my.
Good, good. And I'm putting on my old man glasses so we can get going. Um, it's Brad still there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Fantastic.
This one comes in,
and
you've answered it, but I think you can expand on it. If I haven't read Mr. Thor's, would it be okay to start near dark?
It's a great question. And I would actually suggest that you back up 2 books to Spymaster. I've had people say that they think Spymaster marked a big turning point for Scott Harbath and for the series. People said it almost felt like kind of a reboot sort of a thing. So if you haven't read me before, you absolutely could read Near Dark, but I think you'll appreciate Near Dark. Back up 2 books and start with Spymaster. I think that'd make that whole arc, that this current period in Harbath's life, even more relevant for you. And I think it'd be a lot of fun. I think I'm hoping that you enjoy those enough that you'd want to keep reading. But I think if you read Near Dark and love it, I think you'll go, oh man, I wish I at least started at Spymaster. So that would be my advice for you.
I think you're going to be fine with whatever you're reading with. You're going to have a great time. Here's another one. I assume you did a substantial amount of research for Near Dark. How likely or realistic is the catastrophe described in the book?
Let's see. So how likely or how real is the catastrophe? And I've got to think about the catastrophe. So part of what I do all of the scenarios that I write about are very, very real. These are things that they're wargaming at they wargame everything at the Pentagon. I mean, the Canadians invade. There's a binder that they can pull off the shelf that they've already thought through. How do you fix this? So when people zig, I like to zag. Right? So I was into kind of Islamic terrorism for a while, and then I moved out of that because everybody was piling in, and I just thought, gosh, the market is just saturated with this stuff, and it does have relevancy, and I particularly enjoyed doing The Last Patriot, which a lot of people have said is kind of like a Da Vinci Code style chase meets National Treasure sort of a thing. A lot of fun with Thomas Jefferson in that. But so with Spymaster, so we talked about Spymaster, with the pivot in Spymaster, I actually focused on a different part of the world because I thought, okay, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan for so long, and I think a lot of Americans are war weary. And I thought to myself, wow, well, what might be the next big thing to happen? And I found out that the Rand Corporation did a war game scenario where we lost every single time they did the scenario. They ran the scenario like 1,000 times with real generals from the Department of Defense, and we lost every single time. We could not win. And I said, okay, this is brilliant. This is a part of the world that I think people are really concerned about, and I wanted to weave in what might a president who really had their finger on the pulse of the population, not partisan pulse, but how Americans felt about war. And what might that president be willing to do to make sure that that scenario that the Rand Corporation had done doesn't even come to pass? So basically, how risky an ounce of prevention would a president be willing to do? And of course, risk is what Scott Harvath is all about, my protagonist. So I love this idea of, we're not going to war. I'm going to give you everything you need. We're going to turn our backs, kind of turn our eyes away, and you go and make sure that it doesn't happen. And so that's been kind of the fun of the last 3 books. And it's really interesting because I've had people say that heads of state should be reading Spymaster and Backlash, Near Dark, because of the themes in there with NATO and that part of the world. So I hope that answers the question.
More than it. This is a two-parter. What is your favorite book about writing, the one you go back to time and time again? And do you ever reread your own favorite books?
Okay, two-parter. Okay, so I don't have just one favorite book on writing. I'm going to give you 3, okay? And I get kicked in the butt every time by David Morrell, who's just a great author. I mentioned him earlier, how much I love his writing. But David was a creative writing teacher, and he had a book. It's been retitled, and because I know the old title, I never get the new title right. But it was called Lessons Learned from a Lifetime of Writing by David Morrell, and now that's been shortened. But that's a fabulous book for writers. The other one is On Writing by Stephen King, which is incredible. Every writer should have that. And then anybody who is worth their salt as a writer should also have The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And Pressfield is an unbelievable author in his own right. Gates of Fire, which is all about, if you've seen the movie 300, this is the story that this comes from. And it's actually required reading in the special operations community, which is kind of neat. But Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art is great, just about the creative process and getting over your stumbling blocks and all that kind of thing. So it's not a book necessarily about the art of creative writing, but it is about kind of the soul, if you will, of a writer and how to deal with writer's block and all that kind of stuff and all the distractions that are competing for your attention while you need to be creating art. So that's that. And do I ever reread any of my favorite books? Absolutely. One of my favorite books of all time that I'm about to sit down and reread because I just caught my wife with his latest book is Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth. I love that book. And so my wife today had his new book. It's got a green cover, and I'm spacing on the title. But yeah, I've been wanting to get back and read that again because I read it, 25 years ago. So I want to read it again. And the other book that I love, that I think is one of the most beautifully written books ever, is All the Light We Cannot See. That book I never wanted to end because every sentence, that for me is the gold standard. If I could write like that, oh my gosh. I mean, it's incredible. It's so beautiful.
I'm going to dive into when you go and read those books, what is it that you're reading for? It can't just be for pleasure. I hate to say it, but as a writer, those days are long gone. I mean, yes, I can enjoy something, but you're reading for something
different in nature of those books.
Yeah, I'd be a liar if I didn't tell you it was market research, right? Studying the competition. So it is. I mean, if I had a Mercedes dealership, I would put on a disguise and go over and see what the guys at Audi were doing. How are they treating their customers? Boy, they sold more cars than me last month. I wonder what it is. Is it because of the coffee in the waiting room? So yeah, I do. But here's the great thing for me is if I can lose myself in a book and forget I'm a writer and go back to the pleasure of just being a reader, because that's what I was before I became an author, then I know that I've got a special book that I'm reading. Somebody's done a great job.
That is a perfect answer. Here's our next one. How do you continue to build upon the character of Harvath over 20 books without us readers saying, wait, he would never say or do that? In other words, how do you continue to add layers to this character in such a way that is still the character you created?
Well, that's a super question. So, number one, just on the technical side, is my wife, God bless her, years ago went back and started rereading my books with recipe cards, 3x5 cards, and writing down each character, where they appeared, what book, what chapter, what page, what are their physical characteristics, all that kind of stuff. When you create a universe that spans 20 books, you don't want to get stuff wrong, right? If you've got a recurring character, you don't want to get their hair color wrong or their eye color wrong, that kind of stuff. So there's a technical aspect to making sure I get all that stuff correct. But when it comes to Harvath, my protagonist, he's my alter ego. Just the way I'm sure Jack Ryan was for Tom Clancy and Bond was for Ian Fleming. I always joke that Harvath gets to go and do the things my wife won't let me do. I did go to Afghanistan. If she's ever in earshot when I make that crack, she always reminds me that she did kind of bless me going over there. So I guess a large part of Harvath is a large part of me. So I often say, what would I do in this situation if I had the background and training that Harvath does? But it's interesting. I have to come up with, for instance, a few books ago, somebody asked me in an event, where does his sense of justice come from? What is it about him that makes him want to do what he does? Because I've repeatedly said there's no American dream without brave men and women being willing to protect it. If we didn't have these people defending it, it wouldn't exist. And so I wanted to look into Harvath's childhood for what motivated him, and I came up with a piece from his past, which is there was a developmentally delayed child in his neighborhood on Coronado. He had a bit of a hydrocephalic, and people made fun of this kid because of the size of his head. And Harvath his dad was in the Navy, his dad was a SEAL, and his dad had imprinted upon him that there are people that need to be protected. And Harvath took this to heart at a very early age, and he took this child from his neighborhood under his wing, and he wouldn't let anybody harass him. And I like that about Harvath. And so what's neat is I don't know everything about him. I continue to learn stuff about Harvath that I didn't know was there. So if I see an opportunity to reveal part of his character, or if I see a situation that requires I reveal part of his character to explain his motivation, it's tough, but it's really neat for me because, again, I'm having that experience as a writer that hopefully you are as a reader. You're learning stuff about Harvath, and so am I, constantly.
I'm just going to put on that. Did you ever get to a moment with him or any character where you have a discovery like that and you go, oh, that's what makes sense of 3 books ago, why he did, and you didn't even know it. It's your subconscious mind that was leading you through.
It's a great observation, Jonathan. That's absolutely what it is. And you don't know that this has come back or whatever. That is really rewarding because it shows you that there's other stuff happening. There's a little bit more than you know. I don't want to sound too freaky, but there's a little bit of mysticism involved in writing. You are channeling something. I heard it explained that writing a book is bringing order out of chaos. I've had a couple of people say, why did this character have to die at book signings? And I would just say, again, that's what my doc told me to do. It's what the muse said to do. But you'll find if you're at this game long enough, you will have those moments, those revelatory moments where you say, okay, now that makes sense from all those books ago. And you think, wow, that's amazing. I'm tapped into something that I didn't even know I was tapped into.
Well, but that also makes the character real. It's exactly the way we live our own lives. My daughter says something, and I go, "Oh, you can do that with a character that you've created out of nothing." And that. Anyway, you mentioned it, and so the last question that's come in is going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Why do all of your female interests get killed?
They don't all get killed. I had somebody that got shot and survived, but it was very debilitating for her, and she kissed Harvath off because she knew he wanted to have kids, and she couldn't do it because of her terrible migraines. It's a great question, and I suppose there's probably many answers, but the one that makes sense for me is I haven't wanted to domesticate Harvath. I haven't wanted to need this part of his life to fit into the books. This whole, okay, meanwhile back at the ranch, here's what's going on in his home life and all that kind of stuff. And I also, listen, the divorce rate in the special operations community for a lot of people in the espionage world is very, very high. It is incredibly difficult to maintain these relationships. And I didn't want him to be a bad guy who was leaving women and all this kind of stuff, because that's not who he is. And part of his character, part of what you see of Harvath is that the price he has had to pay to protect all of us, to keep America safe, to make sure we can have that American dream, has been incredibly high. And so, yeah, you want to see him, you like him as a reader. You want to see him settle down and have somebody take care of him and all that kind of stuff. But you, as a free person in a free world, is more important to him than his own happiness. He wants to be happy too, but he's going to keep going no matter what. So it's a little sadistic, I guess, to keep, making him feel all this pain. But it's part of the fuel in his tank. He takes the pain so that you don't have to, so that your wife or your daughter or your brother-in-law or your uncle doesn't have to feel it. So,
well, thank you so much, Brad. I mean, it's just an unbelievable pleasure for us, and wonderful having you, open our 2021 virtual session. Allowing us inside so we can see. I mean, I think you were the one who said it, how the sausage is made. It's a rare treat. It really is. And to see the different layers that you bring to it, the character, the plotting, the research. As I said at the very beginning, what inspires is the speed with which you can do it. But at the heart of all of this is the craft that you bring to it. So as much as my jealousy about the speed is one thing, I really applaud and I appreciate that level of craft. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure being with you. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions. Thanks to the audience and those people who submitted questions. This is my favorite book festival, so I just wish I was in the hostess city again instead of being there virtually, but that's how much I love Savannah and love this festival that I wanted to do this. So my thanks to everyone, all you readers out there, and all of the hard work that I know goes on by volunteers behind the scenes at the book festival. So until we can meet in person, I look forward to it. Thank you for moderating, Jonathan.
My pleasure. And also to the audience, thank you for joining us. We hope that you will join us again on October the 19th for Sandra Brown, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 71 books. Just imagine the questions I would ask her about that. Her latest is Thick as Thieves. For more details, please register, purchase tickets of Thick as Thieves, or get updates on our future events. Just go to our website, which is savannahbookfestival.org. Thank you very much, and good night.